Talks at the COP29 climate conference in Baku, Azerbaijan are deadlocked just 2 days before the talks are due to end. The sticking point is funding to help poor countries address the impacts of climate change. A new draft declaration has been released that includes two options, both suggesting around $1 trillion per year, but rich and developing countries remain far apart on the exact amount needed and where it will come from. Well, for more, let's bring in Aditi Mukherji. She is Director of Climate Change Impact at the Consortium of International Agricultural Research Centers, and she joins us from Baku. Thanks for being with us. Aditi, the stakes are high at this year's COP. What's your impression about where things are headed regarding the agreement on funds for developing countries, including India?
Thank you for having me on the show. The science is clear that the current warming is as a result of the cumulative emissions that have happened over 1.5 centuries. And therefore, these developing countries, including India, who have a lot of development deficits in terms of poverty, water and food security, are asking that we need to fill those development deficits, but do it in a way that are low emissions and do it in a way that are clean and actually adheres to the principles of low emission development. And to be able to do that, these countries are asking for finance to help them to leapfrog from the current fossil fuel regimes to a clean energy regime. And that applies equally to the energy sector as well as to the agriculture sector where I work in. So the demand is that we can and we must move on to low emission futures, but for that these countries require finance, they require capacities and they require technology transfer, and this is precisely the means of implementation on which we are seeing a deadlock in the current NCGUC negotiations. And that means that all the other negotiations, like negotiations on global goals on adaptation, on agriculture, all of those are impacted unless that finance bit of it is actually settled.
Well, let's talk a little more about the finance bit of it there. India is among the countries demanding more than $1 trillion for developing nations to cope with the effects of climate change. How much of a difference could that money actually make?
I'll go back to, I was also one of the IPCC authors, and the science is very clear that we now have the technologies and the approaches to move into low emissions, and for that we require finance to be able to leapfrog. And therefore, this $1 trillion is absolutely crucial for all the developing countries, India, but also very importantly, the least developing countries from Africa, from the small island developing states. This literally means a future that is much, much warmer than what the Paris Agreement entails versus a future that is livable for us all. So therefore, I would say that the finance piece is the absolute centerpiece and important in these negotiations that are going on now.
Talk to us about the specific challenges that India is facing in trying to balance economic development on the one hand and reducing its carbon output on the other.
I think the main challenge comes in, again, in the terms of finance. So right now, India was in news again for very, very high level of air pollution at this year. And every year, this same problem recurs. And the reason is India is a fast-growing economy. There's a lot of economic activities going on, and we are not moving sufficiently fast to clean energy. And a big constraint there is, of course, capital constraint, but also technology and capacity building constraint. So I think we have to look at those development deficits from the eye of how do we move to low emission development and how do we do as fast as we can by transferring technologies and capacities and finance as fast as we can. So I really look into India's development trajectory from an eye of low emission development and what do we need to do to achieve that.
Okay. Aditi, thank you very much for speaking with us today. That was Aditi Mukherji in Baku. Well, as one of the fastest growing economies in the world, India is having to balance the rush to expand its energy and transport infrastructure with the need to protect its environment. DW's Shadu Yadav traveled to Uttarakhand in the Himalayas to explore India's development dilemma.
The mighty Indian Himalayas, source of life for millions and indispensable for the world's climate. Tampering with them has consequences. Dinesh Lal and his wife have been living dangerously in the Himalayan town of Joshimath. Hundreds of homes here have developed cracks, leaving them uninhabitable.
The government should think hard about what's happening here. If you tinker with nature, there will be damage. Where there is development, there will be destruction.
The town has been subsiding since 2021. The residents say that the government hasn't paid enough attention to their suffering. Many were forced to leave their homes, but not everyone has that option. This hydropower plant that you see down there has been under construction and controversial for over a decade now. Locals here in this Himalayan town squarely blame the drilling work here for the damage to their homes. Work was halted here last year after protests, but has now resumed, causing anxiety amongst people. It's not just hydropower plants. Dozens of railways and road expansion projects are underway in this fragile ecosystem as India boosts infrastructure development in the Himalayas. Environmentalists are alarmed by these scenes. They say this development comes at too high a cost. And this is the price Himalayan communities have had to pay. In the last 2 years alone, flash floods and landslides have killed hundreds of people in the states of Himachal Pradesh, Uttarakhand and Sikkim. Environmental activist Atul Sati says human activities are destabilizing the mountains.
At such a sensitive time when climate is rapidly changing, glaciers are receding in the ecologically sensitive mountains. You see so many landslides, and yet they continue to blast the hills for construction. All these big projects and tunneling will be very dangerous for generations to come.
Infrastructure development is a key element in India's growth story. It says it's on course to achieve its aim of becoming a developed nation by 2047. But climate activists say it's not sustainable.
Due to climate change, all the infrastructure that is being built here in mountains is being destroyed, even before it's completed. The impact of tunneling can be seen immediately. One doesn't even have to wait for the damage to unfold. It will only get worse in future.
At the UN's climate talks in Azerbaijan, India has been telling wealthy nations that it has a right to develop. But the people of Joshimath say that this growth is sounding the death knell for them.
Whenever it rains, we both move up to the terrace out of fear. Even if we die, we should die together.
A matter of life and death, not just for the residents, but also for their home, the Himalayas.
The island country of Micronesia is one of the nations that depends on these funds to survive the existential threat posed by climate change.
The past year brought severe drought across Micronesia, depriving us of fresh water for drinking and food production. Yet, we lack the financial, technical, and infrastructural resources to respond effectively. We are not future victims of climate change. We are its present victims, grappling daily with its consequences.
For more, I'm joined now by DW's Leonie from Hammerstein, who is following the climate talks in Baku. Leonie, delegates at the climate conference are trying to reach agreement on providing funds to help developing countries deal with climate change. Are they any closer to reaching an agreement now?
Well, yes and no. Yes, a new negotiating text, you mentioned it, just dropped much later than we anticipated, but still, because we have to remember we're at the biggest, climate diplomacy event. So what countries eventually need to agree on is this text, these words. So everybody's looking at the part about that new climate finance target. And the text as it stands right now shows how much work is yet to be done and how far negotiators are still from agreeing to a compromise, because there's basically two options in the text. One that reflects the view of developing countries and one that reflects the view of developed countries. Now, you mentioned it, both agree that $1 trillion sort of are needed, but there's a big X in front of that amount, so there are no concrete numbers on the table yet. And we have to remember it's only 48 hours to go technically till this conference ends, so there are long hours of negotiations ahead.
Why is it proving so difficult for delegates there to find a middle ground on those climate change funds?
Well, I mean, the big obvious answer is that it's always very hard to agree on money. And now we do see these very different standpoints on a couple of contentious issues. One is the amount of money that should be provided per year from developed countries to developing countries. Secondly, also very importantly, is what form that finance will take. What developing countries are saying is basically we need a lot of that money to come in the form of grants or concessional loans. Now, what developed countries are saying basically is that it needs to be much broader, that there's a lot of different actors that can contribute to climate finance, that the private sector plays an important role, and that all of these should be included in this new collective quantified goal. And the third big point of contention is who actually should contribute to climate finance, not only in terms of these actors, like I just mentioned, but also in terms of what countries, because what developed countries have been saying is that they want countries like China or India, who still count under these UN classifications as developing countries, to step up and contribute as well. Now, these countries are obviously saying that they shouldn't, and that developed countries are, the ones that sort of have caused historically most emissions and should be step up to that responsibility and provide the finance. And yeah, we are now midway through the conference and still at the point that basically we were at before the conference as well. So
right.
Long
Leonie,
hours ahead.
I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there. DW's Leonie von Hammerstein reporting from Baku. Thank you very much.
David Victor is Professor of Innovation and Public Policy at the University of California in San Diego. David, it's good to have you on the program. I want to talk about the efficacy of these annual COP meetings in just a moment. But first, let's talk about China. It's the world's biggest greenhouse gas emitter, and it is a country that is also dealing with the effects of those gases. Can it be on both sides of the coin here?
Yeah, I think they can be on both sides of the coin. The Chinese are doing a lot around climate change, not so much because of climate change. They're doing it because they're worried about air pollution. They're worried about employment, about creating new industries and things like that. But a lot of that correlates with the actions that you need to cut emissions through more renewable power, more nuclear power, more energy efficiency, electric vehicles, and things like that. And the Chinese are indeed one of the world's largest investors in clean energy today.
And yet China continues to build lots of coal burning power plants. So it almost seems like it's the schizophrenic member of the international community when we're talking about trying to mitigate climate change. Is that an accurate assessment?
I think so, but that's true, I think, actually, for almost all the developing countries, and actually many of the industrialized countries, is that they're not just working on climate change, they're working on a whole range of topics. You look at India, for example, also building coal-fired power plants, also a world leader in deployment of solar power, worried about climate change, worried about lots of other things, and they've got to figure out how to do all of that at the same time.
The United States, it is second in the world in carbon emissions. And I'm wondering, with Donald Trump returning to the White House, is the United States, is it part of these discussions, or is it on the sidelines already?
Well, it's part of the conversations right now. The U.S. diplomats have actually been playing a pretty constructive role in Baku. That's what happened last time Trump took over. My expectation is that maybe even on day one of the Trump presidency, he's going to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And frankly, I think that's a good thing, because if they're not going to be constructive, it's better to have them out than in the middle of this process blocking consensus and generally making life hard for other diplomats who want to get real things done.
Yeah, but can you realistically, David, if you've got an emitter as large as the United States not being part of the solution. Can there be a solution?
Well, it's terrible that the United States is not going to play a more constructive role. Where I see solace in all this is that the clean energy revolution is underway. And frankly, it doesn't matter to some degree who's in the White House. We're going to keep deploying wind. We're going to keep deploying solar. We're going to be reopening some of our nuclear plants. We're going to be keeping the existing nuclear plants open. Many places in the country are actually going to fight back. I live in California. The day after the election was called, our governor announced that we're going to have a special session of our legislature to talk about all the things California is going to do to counteract Trump. And so is it ideal? No. But the country is not just the federal government. And in that sense, I've got a little more hope.
Yeah, we also have to tell our viewers California has one of the world's largest economies. I mean, what California does, it matters around the world. Let me ask you about the notion, though, of these COP meetings. This is COP 29. And I dare say if you were to ask most people what was the difference between COP 14 and 19, they wouldn't be able to tell you. Have all of these meetings, have they been worth the effort?
I think to some degree the COPs are unavoidable. So I went, as you said in your opener, I went to the negotiations leading up to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. I went to COP 1, which was in Berlin. I went to COP 2 in Geneva, and then I stopped going to COPs until the COP in Paris because the whole process had just kind of come off the rails. But what it does do that's really important is it creates legitimacy and a kind of an umbrella under which countries can go off and do serious actions on climate change. It would be harder for California or the federal government of the United States, when the federal government is run by people who care about climate change, or many other countries, including in Europe, it'd be harder for them to act on climate change if there weren't some kind of a global umbrella. And that's what these COPs offer, is they're kind of crazy in their complexity and their length and the dramas and so on. But they offer, when they succeed, they offer that umbrella and that patina of legitimacy that's really important then for the real work to happen, which is technological change and policies that happen inside countries.
David Victor with the University of California, San Diego. David, good talking with you. We appreciate your valuable insights tonight. Thank you.
Pleasure as always. Thank you.